Crocodilians often evoke a sense of awe. They are the largest living reptiles and the closest extant relatives of the dinosaurs. Crocodilians are often called living fossils due to resembling their own prehistoric ancestors from the age of reptiles. However, despite popular perception, not only did prehistoric crocodilians exhibit far greater diversity than most people realize, but these semi-aquatic predators represent just a mere fraction of the former diversity of the crocodilian branch of reptiles, Pseudosuchia. Pseudosuchians once filled a bewildering variety of niches, ranging from marine forms who abandoned land entirely, terrestrial predators able to match the dinosaurs themselves, specialized herbivores, agile speedsters, armored tanks, and even long-necked bipedal dinosaur lookalikes. During the late Triassic period, it was the Pseudosuchians who were the most common terrestrial megafauna, with their diversity exceeding that of the early dinosaurs. Even after the Age of Dinosaurs began, Pseudosuchians remained the only fully terrestrial animals able to directly compete with them, so long as one doesn't count the flying pterosaurs as fully terrestrial. After the Mesozoic era ended, one group of surviving Pseudosuchians, the cebechids, went on to become the largest terrestrial predators of the entire age of mammals. Despite all their achievements and vast diversity, most prehistoric Pseudosuchians remain perplexingly obscure. The Pseudosuchian Golden Age during the Triassic period is given little focus compared to the following reign of the dinosaurs, while media depictions of the later crocodile-like species are largely restricted to a handful of exceptionally large taxa like Dinosuchus. The others are largely confined to the background, while the contemporaneous land crocs are lucky to even appear there. The only major exceptions in the last 2 decades are the National Geographic documentary When Crocs Ate Dinosaurs and the recent appearance of the pug-nosed herbivore Simosuchus in Prehistoric Planet. The large, awe-inspiring Cenozoic cebechids like Barenosuchus, the terror of mammals, simply haven't appeared in media at all. Detailed educational material about prehistoric Pseudosuchians is also rare, with books about them being next to non-existent. This is a great disservice to these once abundant and successful reptiles, the sister clade to the dinosaurs and pterosaurs. Many videos on this channel have covered a number of Pseudosuchians, but this one is meant to serve as an overview of Pseudosuchia as a whole. It starts with covering how Pseudosuchia is related to other reptiles, describes their naming conventions, and gives a short rundown of modern crocodilian diversity. This is followed by a brief summary of the clade's 250 million year long history, an examination of features common among the clade, as well as how other traits differed between them. Finally, the second half of the video is an overview of the various subclades within Pseudosuchia, ranging from the familiar to the absolutely bizarre. By the end, you will never be able to look at crocodilians the same way again. Despite the comparisons commonly made between lizards and crocodilians, they're actually on opposite ends of reptilia. Instead, the closest living relatives of crocodilians are birds, the last living dinosaurs. Beneath their superficial differences, crocodilians and birds share a number of anatomical features to the exclusion of other reptiles, including 4-chambered hearts and respiratory systems with unidirectional airflow. Crocodilians, birds, and all extinct reptiles who share a more recent common ancestor with them than with lizards are part of the clade Archosauria. The more restrictive subclade Archosauria, the ruling reptiles, is formed by the last common ancestor of dinosaurs and crocodilia along with all of its descendants. Pseudosuchia is the branch of Archosauria which shares a more recent common ancestor with crocodilians than with dinosaurs. The Archosaurimorphs evolved about 260 million years ago during the late Permian period, but their rise to dominance began during the following Triassic period, the first period of the Mesozoic era. It was possible due to a mass extinction at the end of the Permian called the Great Dying, which was caused by a period of extreme volcanism. Life quickly diversified in its aftermath, and it wasn't long before the Archosaurimorphs had shoved the remnants of the previously dominant animals, the synapsids, to the sidelines. The external appearance of the direct ancestors of the Archosaurs at the beginning of the Triassic period was not that different from that of crocodiles, although they had taller skulls and large downturned snouts. It has even been suggested that some of these reptiles were semi-aquatic, but this remains debated. In any event, these Archosauromorphs quickly became less superficially crocodile-like while simultaneously acquiring more of the traits that would later define Archosauria and in turn Pseudosuchia. By the late Triassic, the Archosaurs had emerged as the most successful of the Archosauromorphs. As mentioned earlier, Pseudosuchia is defined as the clade consisting of crocodilians and all the extinct reptiles which share a more recent common ancestor with them than with any other living species, specifically dinosaurs. All crocodilians are Pseudosuchians, but not all Pseudosuchians were crocodilians. However, since crocodilians are their closest living relatives, they were stem crocodilians. For comparison, early synapsids like the sail-backed Dimetrodon were stem mammals, and non-avian dinosaurs were still stem birds. While some stem crocodilians were nigh indistinguishable from true crocodilians, others had little more in common with them than they did with the dinosaurs. Crocodilia itself was once poorly defined, but is now officially the crown group within Pseudosuchia, meaning it is formed by the living species, their last common ancestor, and all the descendants of that ancestor. The Pseudosuchians formerly classified as crocodilians in decades past now belong to the more inclusive clade Crocodylomorpha, which was the only branch of Pseudosuchia which survived into the second period of the Mesozoic era, the Jurassic Period. Officially, the clade consists of all Pseudosuchians more closely related to crocodilians than to Postosuchus, a fearsome carnivorous Pseudosuchian from late Triassic North America. Many crocodilomorphs, such as Simosuchus, still differed substantially from the crocodilians of today. Others, like the supercroc Sarcosuchus, could easily be mistaken for them, and although outside of the crown group, their similar appearances and lifestyles were the result of common ancestry. These near-crocodilians belong to the crocodilomorph subclade Neosuchia. Unsurprisingly, the definition of crocodilia has caused quite a bit of confusion for non-specialists. Dr. Michael J. Benton, one of the two paleontologists who created the current crown-based definition of crocodilia, eventually changed his mind, and in 2008 proposed revising crocodilia to once again include most of the other crocodilomorphs. However, by then the crown group definition of crocodilia had been in use for 2 decades, so his proposal was rejected. On one hand, classifying distant relatives of crocodilians like the terrestrial Simosuchus as crocodilians would obscure just how different they are from the water-loving Pseudosuchians of today. On the other hand, the current definition also excludes many Neosuchians who were incredibly similar to modern species, so popular sources often simply call them crocodilians anyway. Indeed, some paleontologists will still informally refer to Neosuchians, crocodilomorphs, and occasionally even more distantly related Pseudosuchians as crocodiles, although they will not be referred to as such here for the sake of clarity. It is important to note that crocodilian and crocodile are not synonymous. Crocodiles are those crocodilians which belong to the subclade Crocodiloidea. They are currently the most abundant crocodilians, with the genus Crocodylus containing 13 living species, roughly half of Crocodilia's remaining diversity. Besides Crocodylus, there are 2 other extant crocodile genera, Mescistops, commonly called the slender-snouted crocodiles, and Osteolamius, the dwarf crocodiles. Both genera contain a minimum of 2 species. While alligators are often confused with crocodiles, they belong to a separate branch of Crocodilia, Alligatoroidea. Besides the familiar American alligator, there is also the significantly smaller Chinese alligator. Caimans, today represented by 6 species native to Central and South America, are also alligatoroids, as was the extinct giant Dinosuchus. The smallest remaining branch of crocodilians is Gavialoidea, whose only 2 living species are the true gharial and Tomistoma, commonly called the false gharial. Gavialoids were once much more plentiful, but as will soon be clear, even all of Crocodilia's former diversity is merely a small slice of what was once contained within Pseudosuchia. The name Pseudosuchia, which means false crocodile, was coined in 1887 by paleontologist Carl Alfred von Zittel, who unknowingly created many headaches for future paleontologists. This name may have made sense in the 19th century when it only contained some Triassic relatives of crocodilians rather than the crocodilians themselves. However, it makes much less sense today. Under the modern cladistic system of classification, a clade must include all the descendants of its members, so crocodiles are technically false crocodiles. Another name for the same basic group of animals, Crorotarsi, was used between 1990 to 2011. It was defined as the clade formed by crocodilians and phytosaurs, who were thought to be the earliest diverging Pseudosuchians. Despite their appearance, phytosaurs were not the ancestors of crocodilians, but instead converged upon a similar body plan and lifestyle. In 2011, a major study of Archosaur evolution was published, which concluded that phytosaurs were not Pseudosuchians, but close relatives of both branches of Archosauria. Crorotarsi is technically a valid clade, just one that may incorporate all Archosaurs, not just the stem crocodilians. However, some recent research has found that the phytosaurs may actually be Pseudosuchians as once thought, and while this matter remains unresolved, it will be assumed they are for the purposes of this video. Just as many dinosaur names end in saurus, it is typical for the scientific names of Pseudosuchians to end in suchus. This convention even extends to 3 living species of crocodilians, the black caiman Melanosuchus, and both extant species of dwarf caiman Paleosuchus. Suchus is Latin for crocodile, and originates from the Greek word for the ancient Egyptian god Sobek. Sobek was heavily associated with crocodiles, and often depicted as one or as a human with a crocodile head. The Pseudosuchian Sobecus and the larger clade Sobecidae also derive their names from Sobek. They belong to the even larger clade Sebecosuchia, which basically means either crocodile-crocodile or Sobek-Sobek. The paleontologist who named Sebecosuchia, Dr. George Gaylord Simpson, might have intended for this to be a joke. Although not used as commonly as Suchus, Champsa, the Greek word for crocodile, is also used in the names of many prehistoric crocodilomorphs. So far, no paleontologists have given in to the temptation to follow in the footsteps of Dr. George Gaylord Simpson and named a new species of Pseudosuchian Suchochampsa or Champsasuchus. Of course, there are a number of Pseudosuchians whose name ends in saurus, including the dinosaur-like Poposaurus and even the extinct giant caiman Purusaurus. The name of the large predator Saurosuchus even combines the two. Pseudosuchians also do not have a monopoly on Champsa or Suchus, and the latter is even used in the name of the bizarre stem mammal Estemenosuchus. In addition to their scientific names, some extinct Pseudosuchians have nicknames, such as Simosuchus, the pug croc, Sarcosuchus, the super croc, and Aroripasuchus ratoides, the rat croc. This trend was started by paleontologist Dr. Paul Sereno, who helped discover a number of new and extraordinary extinct crocodilomorphs in North Africa. Fossils of the first Pseudosuchians, such as the sail-backed Tenosauriscus, first appear about 247 million years ago, which was during the end of the early Triassic, and 5 million years after the Permian mass extinction allowed for the rise of the Archosauromorphs. The stem crocodilians steadily became more abundant and diverse until they were the most common large to medium-sized fauna by the late Triassic, which actually began 237 million years ago before even a third of the period had transpired. Still, although this was the Pseudosuchian Golden Age, they had less of a monopoly on large body size than the later dinosaurs and mammals would. The stem crocodilians coexisted with a menagerie of basal Archosauromorphs, proto-mammals, and eventually the first dinosaurs. The Pseudosuchian Golden Age owed its existence to the mass extinction at the close of the Permian period, but it was cut short by another mass extinction 50 million years later at the end of the Triassic period. The only survivors were small crocodilomorphs who soon found the new Jurassic ecosystems were already dominated by a number of much larger dinosaurian survivors. It was during the Jurassic period that some of these crocodilomorphs became amphibious, and by its end, many of these Neosuchians already closely resembled modern crocodilians. However, the crocodilian crown group would not evolve until the late Cretaceous. The more basal, land-loving crocodilomorphs were not just a stepping stone towards crocodilians, and they remained common throughout most of the world for the remainder of the Mesozoic era. A particularly successful clade, Notosuchia, even managed to replace many of the smaller dinosaurs and the largest mammals in the southern continents. The end of the Cretaceous period 66 million years ago was host to yet another mass extinction, and the majority of Crocodylomorpha's diversity perished, alongside the non-avian dinosaurs and countless other clades. The surviving Crocodylomorphs were primarily amphibious Neosuchians. It was once thought that most of their survivors were true Crocodilians, but more recent discoveries have found that other Neosuchian clades were alive and well during the first half of the Cenozoic era. Additionally, a few predatory Notosuchians also survived to terrorize the now dominant mammals, and some Crocodilians left the water to join them. Pseudosuchian diversity crashed yet again when global temperatures fell during the Eocene epoch. The rise of humanity has also taken its toll, with less than 30 species of crocodilians surviving to the modern day, many of which are endangered. Much like the dinosaurs, the Pseudosuchians once occupied a variety of ecological roles. However, even those of the modern species are more diverse than most people realize. For starters, they don't even fill the same niche throughout their lifespan. While most people are familiar with them as large semi-aquatic ambush predators, crocodilian hatchlings are instead insectivores. This echoes the diets of their distant, more active terrestrial ancestors. Their diets continue to shift as they grow, and smaller species like the Yacare caiman never make it to the top of the food chain. There is also substantial variation between the diets of the different species. The broad-snouted caiman focuses on hard-shelled prey. Species with long, narrow snouts like the slender-snouted crocodiles and the false gharial Tomastoma are primarily piscivores, fish-eaters, but they also sometimes hunt medium-sized animals. The true gharial is an even more specialized piscivore. The species of dwarf caimans and crocodiles rarely grow more than 2 meters long, and they tend to hunt nocturnally on land. There is even a distinct population of nearly blind dwarf crocodiles which inhabit caves. The Cuban crocodile is the most terrestrially adapted of any modern crocodilian. It was once the apex predator of prehistoric Cuba, both on land and water, before the arrival of humans caused the extinction of the rest of the island's large terrestrial fauna. With all of this in mind, the differences between modern crocodilians still pale in comparison to the variation exhibited by Pseudosuchia as a whole. Crocodilian teeth are fairly straight and conical. This shape is ideal for holding on to struggling prey, such as slippery fish or large mammals, as they drag them into the water to drown. Similar teeth were common among other aquatic Neosuchians, but the teeth of Pseudosuchians who hunted on land were typically zyphodont. These are the same type of teeth found in Komodo dragons and most of the carnivorous dinosaurs. They are recurved, serrated, and laterally compressed, which makes them very well suited to slice through flesh. Zyphodont teeth were present in many Triassic Pseudosuchians, and independently re-evolved in a number of later terrestrial crocodilomorphs. They were important since most Pseudosuchians could not chew their food, and the terrestrial forms were incapable of executing the death roll Crocodilians used to tear apart large food items. Other Pseudosuchians had different types of teeth. For instance, some semi-aquatic species had short globular teeth, which were used to crush hard-shelled prey like mollusks. Among the land crocs, the teeth of the large predatory Sebecosuchian Rhaesianandrogobe were not compressed, but instead unusually wide. Their shape is similar to those of the later tyrannosaurid dinosaurs, and like them, Rhaesianandrogobe is thought to have been a specialized bone crusher. Another example of a Pseudosuchian with dinosaur-like teeth was the Triassic Revueltosaurus, whose leaf-shaped teeth closely resembled those of ornithischian dinosaurs. Indeed, before complete skeletons were found, Revueltosaurus had been misclassified as an early ornithischian. Like them, it was a herbivore, but most other plant-eating crocs did not share its dinosaur-like dentition. For example, those of the blunt-snouted crocodilomorph Simosuchus were shaped more like maple leaves. Others were analogs to a very different set of animals. Reptilian teeth are usually quite simple, and while those of crocodilians may vary in size, the actual shape of each tooth is basically identical. In stark defiance of this norm, many herbivorous and omnivorous crocodilomorphs evolved complex and highly differentiated teeth analogous to the incisors, canines, premolars, and molars of mammals. Like them, they were able to efficiently chew their food, another rarity among reptiles. Most of these mammal-toothed crocs were terrestrial forms, which belonged to the clade Notosuchia. But the semi-aquatic Neosuchian Eharkutosuchus evolved a similarly complex and efficient set of teeth. As strange as this evolutionary path may seem, even modern crocodilians will, surprisingly enough, regularly consume fruit in the wild. On the other end of the spectrum, a few Triassic Pseudosuchians didn't have teeth at all, possessing toothless beaks in their place. There are some common distinctions between the skulls of terrestrial and aquatic Pseudosuchians. Crocodilians and other species which spent a lot of time in the water needed to be hydrodynamic, so their skulls tend to be very flat. Their eyes and nostrils are also usually positioned high on the skull, allowing them to see and breathe while keeping the rest of their bodies submerged. Most terrestrial Pseudosuchians had deeper skulls, with orbits on the side rather than the top. There are exceptions to these rules. For instance, the Godzilla croc Dacosaurus had a tall, dinosaur-like skull despite being fully aquatic. Likewise, although the Australian crocodilian Baru had a deep, robust skull and teeth with many similarities to Xiphodon teeth, it is still thought to have been semi-aquatic. It appears to have lived in shallow water, where drowning its victims would have been an unreliable strategy, and so evolved typically terrestrial traits as an alternative method to dispatch its prey. Another example is the boar croc Caprosuchus, which is famous for its long, tusk-like teeth. It is only known from a single skull, and paleontologists disagree whether its traits indicate a terrestrial or amphibious existence, and if so, to what extent. The skulls of many Triassic Pseudosuchians resembled those of theropod dinosaurs. This was in part due to their close evolutionary relationship with each other, and many shared characteristics can be seen in close relatives of the Archosaurs, such as Euparkeria. As carnivorous Pseudosuchians and dinosaurs grew in size, their already similar skulls converged upon many of the same solutions to handle larger prey. Archosaurs had two unique fenestrae, openings in the skull. They are the antorbital fenestra, which is in front of the orbits, and the mandibular fenestra, which is in the lower jaw. Crocodilians have since lost their antorbital fenestra, meaning one of the last two remaining groups of Archosaurs lacks one of the iconic features of the clade. A trait common to Crocodylomorpha is that the squamosal bones at the rear of their skull are prominent and overhanging. In some species, they grow so large and elevated that they are called squamosal horns. These horns are not restricted to extinct crocodilomorphs and can still be observed in some modern species like the Cuban crocodile. An important trait in the evolution of crocodilians was the secondary palate, a bone which separates the mouth from the nasal cavity. It helps to reinforce their skulls, allowing Neosuchians to withstand their own exceptionally powerful bites. Perhaps even more importantly, combined with a gular sac, the secondary palate can be used to seal off the mouth from the respiratory system, allowing these semi-aquatic predators to safely open their mouths while underwater, and to breathe while holding on to struggling prey. Some amphibious Pseudosuchians, including the crocodile-like Phytosaurs, lacked a secondary palate, but they may have had a soft tissue equivalent. The snouts of Phytosaurs, crocodilians, and most other semi-aquatic Pseudosuchians come in three basic shapes, which can be used to predict their diets. As mentioned earlier, species with long, slender snouts are adapted to catch fish. Referred to as the longirostrine condition, they have a more hydrodynamic shape, and are able to close their jaws quicker and have an increased range of attack. However, all of this comes at the cost of strength and durability. The opposite is the brevirostrine condition, where the snout is shorter and wider, and is typical of the hunters of large terrestrial animals or hard-shelled creatures such as turtles. Finally, species with an intermediate skull shape, called the mesorostrine condition, tend to be generalists. It is important to note that longirostrine and brevirostrine species are not restricted to terrestrial or aquatic prey, and these broad generalizations do not always apply to the more specialized extinct species. Although the first Pseudosuchians were quadrupeds, bipedalism independently emerged in multiple Pseudosuchian lineages, greatly enhancing their already dinosaur-like appearance. Some, like the Ornithosuchids, were facultative bipeds, meaning they could switch between a four-legged and two-legged stance. Other Pseudosuchians, like Poposaurus, were obligate bipeds. Even the earliest crocodilomorphs are thought to have been bipedal, only later reverting to a four-legged gait. Most bipedal Pseudosuchians lived during the Triassic period, but a few crocodilomorphs reacquired a bipedal stance. For example, bipedal crocodilomorph footprints called Batrachopus grandis have been found in early Cretaceous Korean formations. The terrestrial crocodilian Boverisuchus might have also been capable of running on two legs, but this is less certain. The limbs of most reptiles are held in a sprawling stance, with the limbs spreading out horizontally from the torso. Those of the first Pseudosuchians were instead longer, straighter, and placed directly below their bodies, although there was some variability in just how upright the forelimbs were. Erect legs are typical of active animals like dinosaurs and mammals. This arrangement placed less stress on their limbs, allowed them to breathe when running, and made it easier for them to stand for longer periods of time. Pseudosuchian hind limbs were typically held in what is called the pillar erect stance, an arrangement where the hip socket expands to cover the femur. Dinosaur and mammalian hind limbs are instead held in the buttress erect posture, where the femur attaches to the pelvis from the side. The back legs of early crocodilomorphs like Pterosaurs were held in this dinosaur-like stance, although some later land crocs reobtained the pillar erect stance. It was once thought that the pillar erect stance was unique to Pseudosuchia, but it has since been found in Euparkeria and Silosaurus. Euparkeria was an archosauromorph very closely related to the true Archosaurs, while Silosaurus belonged to the dinosaurian branch of Archosauria and may have even been an actual dinosaur. It therefore seems the pillar erect stance was plesiomorphic, the ancestral state of the Archosaurs.
Another plesiomorphic trait within Archosauria is the crocodile normal ankle, where an ankle bone called the astragalus fits into another called the calcaneum. The ankles of the dinosaurs and the closely related pterosaurs were simple hinges, so the crocodile normal ankle was once thought to be unique to Pseudosuchia. However, this ankle arrangement was also present in the Aphanosaurs, the most basal known dinosaur line archosaurs, so much like the pillar erect stance, the crocodile normal ankle was likely ancestral to Archosauria.
As they became amphibious predators, Crocodilians and the other Neosuchians lost their erect gaits. This was a direct consequence of the evolutionary pressure created by their new aquatic ecologies, since their legs needed to become shorter to create a more streamlined, hydrodynamic shape. Meanwhile, their massive tails, which are a crocodilian's primary form of propulsion in the water, became a major hindrance on land. Nonetheless, even though they sometimes walk in a lizard-like sprawling stance, crocodilians are still able to move in a semi-erect stance called the high walk. The terrestrial abilities of all crocodilians diminish in adulthood due to their increased weight, but adult gharials are unable to assume this stance. On the other hand, they are also the best swimmers of all living crocodilians, but they are far from the most extreme example in the fossil record. A clade of crocodilomorphs called the metriorhynchids became fully aquatic, trading their legs for flippers. Crocodilians can do more than just walk when in a semi-erect stance. Many have retained the ability to gallop, with some species able to reach speeds of up to 18 kilometers or about 11 miles per hour. Even most of the species which cannot gallop, such as alligators, can still reach similar speeds. They're simply less maneuverable when doing so. Still, the terrestrial abilities of even the exceptional Cuban crocodile are a mere shadow of their former glory. Without the baggage that came with a partially aquatic existence, many terrestrial Pseudosuchians were far faster. The recently extinct crocodilian Mekosuchus might have been a specialized tree dweller, but there is otherwise very little research or discussion regarding the climbing capabilities of extinct Pseudosuchians. In spite of this, small crocodilians regularly climb trees today. Even if there were no highly specialized arboreal tree crocs, the leggier ancestors of today's Pseudosuchians were almost certainly competent explorers of the treetops. The same cannot be said for the larger, more cumbersome species. Given how dinosaur-like they were, it should therefore be no surprise that many of these Pseudosuchians had high metabolisms. This allowed them to be much more active and to grow significantly faster than today's ectothermic or cold-blooded crocodilians. Like their erect limbs, a high or warm-blooded metabolism was inherited from their last common ancestor with the dinosaurs. The reason that the ancestors of crocodilians eventually reverted to a lower metabolism is currently a mystery, as the first crocodilomorphs had some of the highest metabolic rates among Pseudosuchia. A lower ectothermic metabolism is certainly ideal for their current niche as sit-and-wait ambush predators, but crocodilomorphs shifted to a lower metabolism long before invading the water. In any event, the last Pseudosuchians still retain vestiges of their endothermic past, such as their previously mentioned four-chambered hearts and overbuilt respiratory system. Although higher than those of most other reptiles, even the metabolisms of the endothermic Pseudosuchians were lower than those of most dinosaurs, particularly birds, reflecting an earlier stage of Archosaurian evolution. While Pseudosuchians may seem more primitive in comparison, there were advantages to their middle-of-the-road approach, as higher metabolisms require much more food to maintain. Thermodynamic models have found another factor behind their lower metabolic rates. Large sauropodomorph dinosaurs like Plateosaurus would have struggled to avoid overheating in the warmer equatorial Triassic environments, where they were, unsurprisingly, absent. In contrast, due to their lower internal body temperatures, similarly sized Pseudosuchians thrived in such climates. While Triassic dinosaurs were much more abundant and diverse in the cooler lands in the extreme north and south, places shunned by ectothermic reptiles, Pseudosuchians were present there as well. Their intermediate metabolisms served Pseudosuchians well for tens of millions of years, but it was also the cause of the sudden end of Pseudosuchia's golden age. During the end-Triassic mass extinction, huge quantities of ash from the volcanic eruptions were released into the atmosphere, partially blocking the sunlight and lowering global temperatures. Unlike the dinosaurs, most Pseudosuchians were unprepared for these suddenly freezing conditions, which could have lasted for up to a decade at a time. It should therefore be little surprise that the only Pseudosuchians to survive were those with the highest metabolisms, the early crocodilomorphs. Ironically, it was the exceptionally low metabolisms of their descendants that allowed them to survive the next mass extinction 135 million years later, while most of the dinosaurs who had replaced them perished. The very trait that allows one to endure one sudden disaster can also doom one in the next. Like crocodilians, most extinct Pseudosuchians had scales as well as osteoderms, bony plates which grew within their skin. Most species had at least 2 rows of osteoderms along their back, but as can be observed in modern crocodilians, many Pseudosuchians went on to expand their osteoderm coverage significantly. The osteoderms from the neck to the middle of the tail were continuous in many crocodilomorphs. This is no longer true in modern crocodilians, but the older arrangement was present in many older Neosuchians. The primary function of Pseudosuchian osteoderms was as armor, but they had other uses. Some of the heavily armored Aetosaurs and their close relatives repurposed their osteoderms into weapons. Those on the back could also be used as a bracing system to reinforce the vertebral column when walking or running, which was particularly important for the megacrocs. Crocodilians have developed additional uses for their osteoderms. They can store a reserve of calcium, which can be released into the blood to maintain proper pH levels. This function evolved in response to the need for crocodilians to remain submerged for long periods of time, during which the acidic molecule CO2 quickly accumulates in their blood. Crocodilian osteoderms are also more vascularized than those of their Triassic ancestors, which makes them much more useful for heat exchange. This trait evolved as they became ectothermic and reliant on absorbing warmth from their external environment. They essentially turned their armor into solar panels. Despite their uses, not all Pseudosuchians retained their osteoderms. Osteoderms are made of bone, and their loss allowed for increased speed and flexibility. The fully aquatic metriorhynchids took this a step further, losing their scales as well. This helped to further streamline their bodies, and mirrors the adaptations of other contemporary marine reptiles. A few extraordinary fossils combined with cutting-edge science have been able to determine the coloration of a few extinct dinosaurs like Borealopelta, but nothing of the sort has been done for prehistoric Pseudosuchians. While it remains speculated what colors they were, Most were probably not the green most crocodilians are depicted as, since crocodilians themselves are not that color. While they come in a wide variety of colors, only a few species like the Nile crocodile are even vaguely green. Indeed, both species of alligator are black, while their hatchlings have yellow stripes. The Pseudosuchians of the past almost certainly came in a vast array of colors as well. A major topic of discussion regarding the integument of prehistoric archosaurs is feathers. Recent discoveries have found that primitive feathers were much more widespread throughout Dinosauria than previously thought, and that they were homologous with similar fuzzy filaments which covered their close relatives, the pterosaurs. Additionally, thermodynamic models have determined that most early dinosaurs and their relatives were reliant on the thermal insulation these feathers provided even in tropical environments. Therefore, at the very latest, feathers first appeared not long after the dinosaur line and crocodile line archosaurs split from each other. Due to the lack of fossils preserving the integument of early Pseudosuchians, the idea that they had feathers as well cannot be outright dismissed, but it is doubtful. The same models which found most Triassic dinosaurs required feathery coats also concluded that all of the tested Pseudosuchians were perfectly fine without them due to their lower intermediate metabolisms. This was true for even the small crocodilomorph Hesperosuchus. Given its size and comparatively high metabolic rate, if Hesperosuchus didn't require thermal insulation, it is doubtful any other Pseudosuchians did either. Furthermore, if stem crocodilians had the same feathery coats as dinosaurs, they wouldn't have been so vulnerable to the volcanic winters at the end of the Triassic period. While they probably didn't have feathers, Pseudosuchians did develop their own unique integumentary innovation called integumentary sense organs, or ISOs for short. These uncreatively named organs can be found on modern crocodilians and are small, dome-shaped structures on their scales. They allow them to feel movements in the water, but it has also been suggested that ISOs may play a role in detecting infrasound, water pH level, and temperature. ISO fossils have been found on aquatic Neosuchians and Thalattosuchians, but they are absent in terrestrial species. While most reptiles abandon their eggs after laying them, Pseudosuchians are not most reptiles. Crocodilian mothers guard their nests and carry their babies to the safety of the water once they hatch. Although crocodilian hatchlings are capable of hunting on their own, their mother may protect them for up to 2 years. Crocodilian fathers usually have little interaction with their offspring, but male gharials are an exception to the rule. Parental care is also exhibited by most birds, whose offspring are often completely dependent on their parents after hatching. It was also common among many other dinosaurs, indicating this behavior was likely present in the first archosaurs.
It can therefore be inferred that many of the extinct Pseudosuchians were also good parents.
While most of their paternal behavior remains speculation, a large number of nests belonging to the Barusuchid Notosuchian Pissara champsa were found together, suggesting these crocodilomorph mothers nested together for mutual protection. Each nest only contains about 4 or 5 eggs, far fewer than the number laid by crocodilians, suggesting they invested much more effort into taking care of their offspring than modern Pseudosuchians do. It has recently been discovered that crocodilians are capable of parthenogenesis, meaning females can lay eggs without a mate. Since parthenogenesis has also been observed in birds and other reptiles, it was likely present in the first Pseudosuchians. The offspring produced from parthenogenesis are usually all female, but crocodilian sex determination is based on egg temperature rather than chromosomes. This means that if the Pseudosuchian equivalent of Jurassic Park was ever made, the inexplicable use of frog DNA probably wouldn't be necessary for their population to get out of control. Many Pseudosuchians looked quite different from their more familiar representatives, but the opposite phenomenon was also true. The Triassic phytosaurs were not alone in filling the niches now held by crocodilians, nor in converging upon a similar appearance. Some giant Permian temnospondyl amphibians like Prionosuchus and Australorpyton had crocodile body plans long before the evolution of the archosaurs.
True crocodilians later lived side by side with the croc-mimic Champsosaurus, a reptile who wasn't closely related to anything alive today.
Some other crocodilomorphs like Mahajunkasuchus, the Pepasuchines, and perhaps the marine Thalattosuchians also converged upon crocodilian-like niches, making these Pseudosuchians truly fake crocodiles. Like the Phytosaurs, they will be covered in more detail later in the video. Close relatives of the Archosaurs called Proterochampsins were once thought to have been crocodile analogues, although they are now interpreted as fully terrestrial animals. Finally, the list would not be complete without mentioning the spinosaurid dinosaurs. Due to regularly hunting fish, their elongated snouts came to resemble those of crocodilians, and the name of the spinosaurid Suchomimus even means crocodile mimic. However, in truth, the similarities between spinosaurids and crocodilians are often overstated. Most spinosaurids caught fish by wading in shallow water like gigantic herons or bears, while others may have actively chased their prey underwater. They also dealt with terrestrial prey much like other theropod dinosaurs did, only with their giant hand claws playing a greater role due to their weaker jaws. In contrast, due to their ectothermic metabolisms, crocodilians are only effective as ambush predators. Even their ability to gallop can only be done in short bursts, and is usually done to escape to the safety of the water. Ironically, it has recently been proposed that the Pseudosuchians the Spinosaurs were most convergent with were not crocodilians, but a different clade of dinosaur-like species from the Triassic period. The rest of this video is an overview of the grand diversity contained within Pseudosuchia, covering each of the major clades and a number of the most notable species. Many of these reptiles have been the subjects of their own, more in-depth videos on this channel, and others will be in the future. The Phytosaurs will be covered first, since some recent papers have continued to place Phytosauria as the earliest diverging clade of Pseudosuchians. Although ultimately the result of convergent evolution, those who may have been some of the first Pseudosuchians did closely resemble the current Pseudosuchians in both appearance and lifestyle. The oldest recorded phytosaur is the marine Diandongosuchus from Middle Triassic China, who was already a specialized semi-aquatic predator. All other known phytosaurs are from the late Triassic, and they had a global distribution. Like crocodilians, phytosaurs were ectothermic and had short legs. Still, they remained more erect than those of crocodilians, and the European phytosaur Nicrosaurus is even thought to have been primarily terrestrial. In contrast, the marine phytosaur Mysteriosuchus had paddle-like limbs, so it would have been almost entirely aquatic. Much like crocodilians, piscivorous phytosaurs like Rutiodon had thin, longirostrine skulls, with little differentiation in tooth size. While the skulls of large prey specialists such as Rodontosaurus were robust like those of ecologically analogous crocodilians, they were not wide, and their teeth were heterodont, varying in shape. They included serrated teeth, more typical of terrestrial archosaurs, and even large, tusk-like teeth at the end of their snouts. Many phytosaurs had bony crests in front of their eyes. They were likely used for visual display, but they would have also made it easier to breathe in the water since they were also where the nostrils were placed. The nostrils of crocodilians and other Neosuchians are instead at the front of the snout, which is perhaps the most commonly mentioned difference between phytosaurs and crocodilians. In the grand scheme of things, this is relatively minor, as despite filling the same niches in their superficially similar appearance, creatures like this had more anatomical traits in common with crocodilians than the phytosaurs did. Still, it is an easy way for non-specialists to tell the two apart at a glance. While even the largest modern crocodilians don't grow much more than 6 meters long, some phytosaurs, such as the North American Smilosuchus and the Indian Colossosuchus, attained a length of 8 meters. They would have been a threat to even the largest terrestrial animals of the time. Regardless of whether or not phytosaurs were Pseudosuchians, it is not entirely clear what the last common ancestor of Pseudosuchia looked like. It may have been a small animal, similar to Euparkeria. However, early members of many Triassic Pseudosuchian subclades were medium-sized, if still lightly built, predators, a trend also seen in the early dinosaur-line archosaurs such as the Aphanosaurs. One example of such a basal Pseudosuchian is the 3-meter-long Tachinosuchus, which lived in Middle Triassic Europe. Although primarily terrestrial, the holotype was found with fish remains in its gut, foreshadowing what was to come. Some Pseudosuchian lineages, such as Herpetosuchidae, fizzled out long before the cataclysmic end of the Triassic period. Restricted to the first half of the period, Herpetosuchids were heavily armored carnivores, ranging from half a meter to 3 meters long. A diagnostic trait of the clade is that the upper tooth row is much shorter than the lower tooth row. While their skulls were not flattened like those of crocodilians, they were broader than those of most other contemporary Pseudosuchians. The largest species, Tardigrade, is currently the only known herpetosuchid with serrated teeth, implying it had a different diet than its smaller relatives. Gracilsuchidae was another early subclade of Pseudosuchians, which, like most herpetosuchids, consisted of small, generalized carnivores. The Gracilsuchids Terphanosuchus and Yonghesuchus had small teeth on their palates, an unusual trait among Archosaurs. Gracilsuchus itself has sometimes been reconstructed as a biped, but the forelimb fossils this posture was based on are no longer assigned to it. A clade of Basal Pseudosuchians who were bipedal was Ornithosuchidae. However, as mentioned earlier in the video, they were only facultative bipeds, spending most of their time on all fours. Ornithosuchids had large, triangular skulls with downturned snouts, which made them look a bit like evolutionary throwbacks to earlier Archosauromorphs like the Erythrosuchids. A typical ornithosuchid like the South American Riohasuchus was only about 2 meters long. However, Ornithosuchus itself could grow up to 4 meters long. Ornithosuchids had the zyphodont teeth of meat eaters, but beyond that, it is unclear what they ate. While biomechanical models found their large skulls were able to generate powerful bites, they were unable to handle the stresses that came from handling large, struggling animals. On the other hand, their jaws were not able to move fast enough to catch smaller prey. It has been proposed that they were specialized scavengers, but large, land-bound carnivores like the Ornithosuchids would have been unable to find enough carrion to sustain themselves. A more recent study found the skull of the Ornithosuchid Riohasuchus was surprisingly hydrodynamic and would have been an excellent trap for fish. Because of this, it has been hypothesized it and other Ornithosuchids were waders who hunted fish in a manner similar to the Spinosaurid dinosaurs. Their bipedal stance would have allowed them to stand higher in the water, and although they had few aquatic adaptations, they did have laterally compressed tails like those of crocodilians. Some of the most recognizable Triassic Pseudosuchians were the Aetosaurs. In many ways, they were Pseudosuchian equivalents to the later Ankylosaur dinosaurs, with their osteoderms having evolved into an extensive armored carapace. Some of the tank crocs also evolved spikes, and the shoulder spikes of the Aetosaur Desmatosuchus grew to an impressive length of half a meter. Desmatosuchus was about 5 meters long, and the largest Aetosaur, Typothorax, is thought to have been capable of growing even larger. The smallest Aetosaurs have generally been considered to be only 1 meter long, but some of these smaller specimens, including Aetosaurus itself, have turned out to merely be juveniles. 24 Aetosaurus skeletons have been found together, suggesting young Aetosaurs lived in groups for mutual protection. Aetosaurs were fairly diverse. While many had relatively narrow torsos, others, like Typothorax, had comedically wide bodies. Aetosaurs' skulls were small and narrow, and in many species, the front of the mouth was toothless and shovel-shaped, which may have been an adaptation for digging. In general, the Aetosaurs are thought to have been herbivores who focused on low-lying plants like ferns and underground roots. However, a few tank crocs with sharper teeth, including Aetosauroides, are thought to have instead been omnivores, adding insects and even small animals to their diets. One of the closest relatives of the Aetosaurs was Revueltosaurus, the Pseudosuchian with teeth like those of an ornithischian dinosaur. It was only about 1 meter long, but had a proportionally larger head than those of its Aetosaur cousins. Revueltosaurus was not only heavily armored, but also possessed a club-like structure at the end of its tail, another feature stem crocodilians evolved before the dinosaurs. Perhaps the most diverse clade within Pseudosuchia is Poposauroidea. The most basal poposauroid, Chianosuchus, was a medium-sized semi-aquatic predator. It lived in southern China during the Middle Triassic, a time when its home was a sea dotted with islands. While it was well adapted towards hunting in the water, Chianosuchus's legs were unusually long compared to most other semi-aquatic predators, so in addition to catching aquatic prey, it was also likely the top terrestrial predator on the islands. Chianosuchus's osteoderms were smaller and fewer in number than those of most other Pseudosuchians, but they are entirely absent in more derived poposauroids. The poposauroid clade Tenosauriskidae contains 6 species, including some of the oldest recorded Pseudosuchians. Tenosauriskids were widespread across the supercontinent of Pangaea during the early and middle Triassic. Their most notable trait was the large sail on their backs, which today makes their rare depictions easily mistaken for inaccurate reconstructions of the Permian synapsid Dimetrodon. Unfortunately, most Tenosauriskids are only known from their distinctive vertebrae, but the Tenosauriskid Arizonosaurus is known for more substantial remains. It was a medium-sized predator from Middle Triassic North America. While typically reconstructed as a quadruped, Arizonosaurus's limbs are missing, so a bipedal gait is plausible. This would have made it look less like Dimetrodon and more like a small Retrospinosaurus. On the other hand, the namesake of Poposauroidea, Poposaurus, was an unambiguous biped. This stem crocodile looked like it was trying really hard to mimic the outdated, scaly depictions of dromaeosaurid dinosaurs. Poposaurus had a small hump on its elongated tail, which may have been an evolutionary remnant of the Tenosauriskid sails. A less threatening group of theropods, the Ornithomimosaurs, had their own scaly poposauroid lookalikes, a bit ironic since the Ornithomimosaurs themselves are commonly compared to ostriches. Named the Shuvosaurids, these Pseudosuchians were bipeds with long necks and toothless beaks. They are thought to have cropped soft foliage with the front of their beaks, with their bipedal stance offering them greater browsing opportunities than most other Triassic herbivores. The largest specimens of Shuvosaurus and the closely related Ephygia are not very big, but they are only known from juveniles. The largest Shuvosaurid was Psilosuchus, which an isolated fossil suggests may have grown 9 to 10 meters long, making it one of the largest herbivores of the entire Triassic period. Shuvosaurids, large or small, would not have been as fast as ostriches or ornithomimosaurs due to their shorter legs and longer torsos. Although they are only known from 3 species, fragmentary Shuvosaurid fossils indicate the clade had a range from 245 million years ago to the end of the Triassic period 200 million years ago. A particularly unusual poposauroid was Lodosaurus, who lived in Middle Triassic China. It had a toothless beak like the Shuvosaurids, suggesting that it was also a herbivore. Unlike them, Lodosaurus was a dedicated quadruped. It also had elongated back vertebrae, which may have supported a hump or a short sail like those of the Tenosauriskids. While the stem crocodiles came in a wide array of forms, none were so varied as Poposauroidea. Some poposauroids were once placed within the final group of Pseudosuchians outside of Crocodylomorpha, which is a collection of predators commonly called Rauisuchians. Since the Crocodylomorphs are their direct descendants, the Rauisuchians do not form a true clade with each other, even though their similarities were inherited from a common ancestor. The least inclusive clade Rauisuchians belong to is Loricata, of which the Crocodylomorphs represent a divergent and highly successful branch. Early Loricatans were lithe, medium-sized predators. 10 individuals of the 2.5-meter-long Loricatan Dicuriasuchus have been found buried together, so some Rauisuchians may have hunted in packs. Since even today's Cuban crocodiles have been observed working together when hunting, the idea is not far-fetched. Dicuriasuchus lived in what is now Brazil during the Middle Triassic, predating the oldest known dinosaurs by several million years. More typical Triassic Rauisuchians were larger, bulkier, and had huge, boxy skulls. The Rauisuchians had risen to the top of the food chain by the start of the late Triassic, a position they held uncontested until their demise at the end of the period. Many of these predators resembled quadrupedal versions of their dinosaurian replacements. The 6-meter-long Rauisuchian Postosuchus took this to an even greater extreme, with a specialized bipedal gait. While it was probably not unique in this regard, the skeletons of other closely related Rauisuchians are often too incomplete to determine what stance they assumed in life. In any event, bipedalism was a derived trait within Loricata, as more basal species like Prestosuchus were unambiguously quadrupedal. Other Rawasuchians were presumably facultative bipeds, representing the transition between Prehistoric-like forms and Postosuchus. Postosuchus itself is easily the most famous Rawasuchian, and arguably the most iconic Triassic Pseudosuchian. Its fossils are found in both the southwestern and eastern United States, where it was once the apex predator. Besides their different gaits, the Rawasuchian grade Loricotans have generally been treated as interchangeable, but recent discoveries have made it increasingly clear that there was substantial ecological disparity between these predators. For instance, some Rawasuchians, like Batrachotomus, bit into bones when feeding more often than theropod dinosaurs typically did. In contrast, the 7-meter-long Loricotan Saurosuchus had a much weaker bite force than would be expected for a predator of its size, and it would have been forced to leave significant amounts of flesh from its kills uneaten. While it was one of the largest Triassic predators, Saurosuchus was not the largest Rawasuchian. That was instead Fossilosuchus. While not known from a complete skeleton, estimates based on its smaller relatives suggest its total length was between 8 to 10 meters, exceeding the size of any other Triassic predator yet found. Its massive size seems to have, ironically, been in response to the local dinosaurs. Even though most early dinosaurs were overshadowed by Pseudosuchians until the Jurassic period, the long-necked sauropodomorph dinosaurs had already become some of the largest herbivores the world had yet seen. This prompted Fossilosuchus and its kin to grow larger, enabling them to hunt these new titans. None of these large predators survived the extreme volcanism at the end of the Triassic period, and the formerly smaller theropod dinosaurs were swift to replace them as the top predators. Fortunately, some of their crocodilomorph descendants like Borenosuchus later came to resemble these Triassic terrors. The first crocodilomorphs, such as Carnifex and Redondovenator, were themselves large bipedal predators not substantially different from Rawasuchians like Postosuchus. These basal forms first appeared about 230 million years ago, close to the midpoint of the Triassic, and seem to have been restricted to what is now North America. They lasted to the end of the period, perishing alongside the Rawasuchians and all the other contemporary large Pseudosuchians. The next stage of crocodilomorph evolution were the Sphenosuchians. Most Sphenosuchians were fleet-footed predators, well adapted for chasing down insects and small vertebrates. Usually less than a meter long, Sphenosuchians are often described as the reptilian equivalents of foxes, and seem to have replaced the Gracilossuchids and Herpetosuchids during the late Triassic. Their metabolisms were among the highest within Pseudosuchia, and Sphenosuchian legs were remarkably long, indicating they were capable of great bursts of speed. Given how much longer their hind limbs were than their forelimbs, at least some species of Sphenosuchians were bipedal. Sphenosuchians were the direct ancestors of all later crocodilomorphs. As such, like the Rawasuchians, they are not a clade, but an evolutionary grade. An aberrant Sphenosuchian was the potentially herbivorous Syntama prosopis. It had a short, broad snout, although it is uncertain whether all of its fossils belong to the same animal, leaving its crocodilomorph identity unconfirmed. Sphenosuchian crocodilomorphs survived the mass extinction at the end of the Triassic and remained common during the early Jurassic. By the late Jurassic, they had been almost entirely replaced by more derived crocodilomorphs. But even the last Sphenosuchians didn't stop innovating. The late Jurassic Macalognathus evolved a small beak at the end of its mouth, and may have even been a herbivore. The next stage of crocodilomorph evolution were the Protosuchians, another paraphyletic evolutionary grade. The backs of their skulls were wide, a trait retained today by even the slender-snouted gharial. Combined with other new traits, such as smaller fenestra, Protosuchian skulls were stronger and able to generate a powerful bite force despite their small size. Their limbs were typically shorter than those of their Sphenosuchian ancestors, and quadrupedalism was the norm within the grade. These crocodilomorphs first evolved during the Triassic, but only became common after the dawn of the Jurassic. Like their faster ancestors, Protosuchians were generally small predators and insect eaters. At 1 meter long, Protosuchus itself was fairly typical in this regard. Other Protosuchians broke the mold to varying degrees. For example, the late Jurassic Adentosuchus, and some currently unnamed Protosuchians from the early Jurassic were herbivores. The makers of the bipedal Batrachopus footprints from early Cretaceous Korea are thought to have been made by a 3-meter-long Protosuchian. A Protosuchian genus from mid to late Jurassic China, Seisosuchus, also reached a length of 3 meters. Although reconstructed here as a crocodile-like creature, Seisosuchus had the tall skull and the zyphodont teeth of a terrestrial predator. By the early Cretaceous, Protosuchian-grade crocodilomorphs were largely restricted to Europe and Asia, and they had become rare by the late Cretaceous. Still, the Protosuchian Gobiosuchus was actually a contemporary of the famous dinosaurs Protoceratops and Velociraptor, and a single Protosuchian, Nukensuchus, has been found in late Cretaceous South America, which was otherwise dominated by the more derived Notosuchians. The limb proportions of the late Cretaceous Protosuchians were more like those of their Sphenosuchian ancestors, suggesting these late survivors filled similar niches. Some of the closest relatives of the more derived crocodilomorphs were the Sharktogosuchids, who had already acquired the secondary palate that would prove so critical in crocodilian evolution. Most lived in Asia during the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous, but the Sharktogosuchid Fruitachampsa is found in the North American Morrison Formation, where it coexisted with the most famous Jurassic dinosaurs. Perhaps the most successful Jurassic crocodilomorphs were the marine Thalattosuchians. Since its members looked similar to crocodilians, Thalattosuchia was once placed within Neosuchia. However, the classification of the Thalattosuchians is now uncertain, and they may be a separate lineage of crocodilomorphs who took to the water independently from the ancestors of today's crocodilians. In any event, the first Thalattosuchians appeared during the early Jurassic. They started out with elongated snouts, filled with narrow teeth well suited for catching cephalopods and fish. The oldest, unambiguous Thalattosuchian is Turnersuchus, while the rest of Thalattosuchia can be divided into 2 major subclades, Teleosauroidea and Metriorhynchoidea. The Metriorhynchoids were the most specialized of the two, and those belonging to the subclade Metriorhynchidae were fully aquatic. Still, even the Teleosauroids were better suited for water than land. Their hind limbs were usually twice the length of their forelimbs, which made terrestrial locomotion slower and less efficient for them than it is for most modern crocodilians. Most teleosauroids were longirostrine species, which hunted small, aquatic prey along the coasts in a manner comparable to today's gavialids. Still, there were some who broke from the mold. The skulls of the Macamosaurids were wider, their snouts shorter, and their teeth thicker, allowing them to hunt large marine reptiles and hard-shelled species like turtles or ammonites. Macamosaurus itself grew 7 meters long, and fossils from another teleosaurid from early Cretaceous Columbia are estimated to have come from an individual over 9.5 meters long. Other teleosauroids expanded into new habitats. In prehistoric Thailand, the teleosauroid Indocenosuchus inhabited freshwater environments. Some teleosauroids, like the heavily armored Platysuchus, are thought to have been semi-terrestrial, while members of the teleosauroid subclade called Aleodontinae are thought to have spent more time in the open ocean. However, that was primarily the domain of the Metriorhynchoids. Much like crocodilians, their tails were their main source of propulsion, but they added a tail fluke to the design. The feet of the derived Metriorhynchids evolved into flippers, severing their ties to land. Metriorhynchids are the only archosaurs known to have become fully aquatic animals, and, alongside the more famous ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, were one of the 3 major groups of Jurassic marine reptiles. Given their wide hip openings, it is suspected that Metriorhynchids gave birth to live young. Only one other archosauromorph, the Triassic Dinocephalosaurus, is known to have done the same. As mentioned earlier, many Metriorhynchids not only lacked osteoderms, but uniquely among Pseudosuchia, scales, which helped to streamline their bodies. The basal Metriorhynchoid Magyarosuchus still had feet and osteoderms, but it already had the tail fin. Teleosauroids retained both scales and osteoderms, but most were less heavily armored than crocodilians. Metriorhynchids had intermediate metabolisms. While lower than those of the contemporary ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, their metabolic rates were much higher than those of crocodilians. Their teleosauroid cousins were instead ectotherms, which seems to have been the ancestral state of Thalattosuchia. While teleosauroids were ambush predators like their modern analogues, the more active metriorhynchids were pursuit predators, with orbits on the sides of the skull instead of the top. Some species, like Crocodilians, continued to hunt fish and cephalopods as their ancestors had, only using different tactics. Others mirrored the evolutionary path taken by the Macamosaurids and shifted to hunting larger prey. The metriorhynchid Pseudosuchia was 7 meters long and was one of the top predators of the late Jurassic seas. Another species, the Godzilla croc Dacosaurus, is unusual in that it had zyphodont teeth and, as mentioned earlier, a deep skull similar in shape to those of the theropod dinosaurs. Teleosauroid diversity crashed at the end of the late Jurassic, perhaps due to a decline in oceanic temperatures. The metriorhynchids continued to thrive for much of the early Cretaceous, but both clades of Thalattosuchians had perished before the start of the late Cretaceous. Some of the most diverse Pseudosuchians were the crocodilomorphs belonging to Notosuchia, the sister clade of the semi-aquatic Neosuchians. Although almost entirely absent in the north, Notosuchians were a very common component of the fauna in the southern continents during the Cretaceous period, which had all formerly belonged to the supercontinent Gondwana. The various species of Notosuchians will not be covered in any particular order, since their interrelationships are not well understood. For instance, while this video considers Notosuchia the proper name for these crocodilomorphs, some papers instead place Zyphosuchia, which is usually considered a major Notosuchian subclade, as the sister group of Neosuchia, with the Notosuchians being a smaller branch within Zyphosuchia. Notosuchus itself was a small carnivore ecologically similar to most Protosuchians. However, a greater number of Notosuchians were omnivores or even dedicated herbivores. One of the most visually distinctive was the pug croc Simosuchus, who lived in Madagascar at the very end of the Cretaceous period. This meter-long herbivore was heavily armored, had one of the proportionally shortest Pseudosuchian tails, and its forelimbs were longer than its hind limbs. Atypically for a Notosuchian, Simosuchus's legs were held in a semi-erect gait despite being fully terrestrial. Other plant-eating Notosuchians, such as Pachysuchus, looked less unusual than Simosuchus, but appearances can be deceiving. It was these land crocs who evolved complex, mammal-like teeth. The Notosuchian Chimaerosuchus, which inhabited early Cretaceous China, was even mistaken for a mammal when it was first discovered. Combined with their erect limbs, these crocodilomorphs were able to fill niches otherwise restricted to mammals and dinosaurs. The omnivorous 2-meter-long Armadillosuchus is one of the most famous prehistoric Notosuchians, but it is also one of the most misunderstood. A reconstruction of the skeleton gave it armor like an actual armadillo, which has since been copied by most paleoart depicting this species. The armor of the real armadillo croc was much more typical of other crocodilomorphs. While the osteoderms on its neck were fused together, the round osteoderms on the back were simply arranged in rows matching the plate-shaped osteoderms over its spine. This reminded the paleontologists who described Armadillosuchus of the bands of armadillos, but this feature is ironically absent in the taco shell reconstructions. Indeed, the armor of the Triassic Aetosaurs resembled the bands of armadillos more than Armadillosuchus's osteoderms did. Its armor may not have even been visible in life, as recent discoveries have found that the osteoderms of many Notosuchians seem to have been covered by a layer of leathery skin. The basal Notosuchian genus Arorhipasuchus proved to be highly successful. This small omnivore was widespread across the southern hemisphere 120 million years ago, during the early Cretaceous, but a species of Arorhipasuchus still existed 66 million years ago, right at the end of the Mesozoic era, making it perhaps the longest-lasting Pseudosuchian genus of all time. While it is crocodilians who get labeled as living fossils, Arorhipasuchus was able to thrive for at least 50 million years with even less evolutionary modification. Of course, like the other so-called living fossils, Arorhipasuchus was also capable of radical and rapid change when it was called for. Early in their evolutionary history, a species of Arorhipasuchus diverged enough to warrant its own genus, a Notosuchus. Nicknamed the duck croc for its broad, flat snout, A Notosuchus is thought to have hunted aquatic prey from the shore and shallow water, the opposite of how crocodilians hunt. While Notosuchians were ancestrally terrestrial animals, some became semi-aquatic predators highly convergent with crocodilians and phytosaurs, with low skulls and short legs. Species such as Roxachampsa and Aetosuchus typically hunted a variety of prey, but specialized in eating hard-shelled animals like turtles. Their subclade is inconsistently referred to as Aetosuchidae or Pepasuchinae, depending on where they are placed within Notosuchia, but regardless of which name is used, both groups contain essentially the same group of creatures. Another Notosuchian who took to the water was the closely related 4-meter-long Majungasuchus. Sometimes nicknamed the hippocroc or marauder croc, it had a massive, powerful skull and was one of the top predators in its island home of Madagascar. Still, crocodilian mimicking Notosuchians had not completely replaced actual crocodilians and their Neosuchian cousins in the southern hemisphere. Although they were less common, Neosuchians such as Titanochampsa could still be found even in environments filled to the brim with Notosuchians. Caprosuchus, the long-toothed boar croc, was closely related to Majungasuchus. It lived in what is now North Africa during the beginning of the late Cretaceous. As mentioned earlier, it is currently debated whether or not Caprosuchus was a land croc or if it lived in a manner more like Mahajungasuchus and the Neosuchians. On the other hand, these not crocs were closely related to a group of unambiguously terrestrial predators called pterosaurids. The pterosaurids had narrow, deep skulls and zyphodont teeth. For predators in a dinosaur-dominated world, these land crocs were fairly large, with Pterosaurus itself measuring 2.5 meters long. Pterosaurid fossils are found in both Africa and South America, and the Pterosaurid Hamadasuchus was even a contemporary of the famous North African dinosaur Spinosaurus. They are often referred to as dog-like, although the nickname dog croc is already taken by Arorhipasuchus wageneri. Pterosaurids coexisted with a separate clade of medium-sized predatory Notosuchians, the Baurusuchids. They would have frequently preyed upon their fellow land crocs, but their sizable zyphodont teeth were particularly well suited for dealing with larger prey. A single Baurusuchid would have been capable of killing the contemporary dwarf sauropod dinosaur Iberania, and a pack would have been able to hunt even bigger dinosaurs. Baurusuchids had a weaker bite force than most Pseudosuchians. Much like modern Komodo dragons, they relied on their neck muscles to pull their knife-like teeth through their prey's flesh after biting down. Even the smaller Baurusuchids, such as the 1.5-meter-long Gondwanasuchus, were deadly predators for their size. The Baurusuchids were not closely related to the Pterosaurids, instead belonging to Sebecosuchia, the same clade as the bone-crushing Rhazan androgobe. This throwback to the Rawasuchians lived in Middle Jurassic Madagascar, and is the sole Notosuchia known from the entire Jurassic period. With an estimated length of 7 meters and a weight of 1 ton, Rhazan androgobe was a match for even the largest contemporary theropods. Cretaceous Notosuchians did not compare to this titan, but between the Baurusuchids and Pterosaurids, there were fewer small predatory dinosaurs in their range. Those who did exist were generally specialized species who didn't compete with the larger Notosuchians. While the top predators and largest herbivores of the Cretaceous Gondwanan continents remained exclusively dinosaurian, the diverse Notosuchians had supplanted many of the smaller species as well as many of the larger mammals, bringing about something of a Pseudosuchian renaissance. What makes the success of the Notosuchians all the more surprising is their metabolisms. Although initially expected to have high metabolisms like the Sphenosuchians and many of the other animals they had replaced, examination of their bone histology has found most were actually ectotherms. Although their metabolic rates were usually higher than modern crocodilians, Notosuchians are the only ectotherms known to have fully erect limbs. Still, some species, including the Baurusuchids and Notosuchus itself, had higher growth rates and presumably metabolisms. Much as with Poposauridae, broad generalizations are hard to apply to Notosuchia. The Notosuchian Renaissance ended at the end of the Cretaceous period, but there was a single group of survivors, the Sebekids. Sebecidae was a clade of Sebecosuchians closely related to the Baurusuchids. While Pseudosuchia may mean crocodile, the Pseudosuchians were ironically the most distantly related to the true Crocodilians out of all the Cenozoic Pseudosuchians. The Pseudosuchians alive during the dawn of the Cenozoic era seem to have initially been small predators like Zulmasuchus, but they rapidly grew in size. By the end of the Paleocene epoch, the Pseudosuchian Bretosuchus was already 4 meters long. Most, like Pseudosuchus itself, were about 3 meters long, but the largest Pseudosuchians, Borenosuchus and Neosuchia, are estimated to have grown 6 meters long and to have weighed over 1.5 tons. It was these Pseudosuchians who were the largest terrestrial reptiles after the Age of Reptiles ended, and quite possibly the largest terrestrial predators of the entire Cenozoic era. They resembled both Rhazan and Androgobe and their distant Triassic ancestors like Prehistoric, and were the closest evolution has come to reinventing the massive theropods of the Mesozoic era. A major difference is that their skulls were no longer so dinosaur-like, a result of more than 100 million years separating them from their distant Rauisuchian ancestors. Some Pseudosuchians had colonized Europe by the end of the Mesozoic, and, as in South America, their descendants were among the top predators there during the early Cenozoic. Eocene fossils from North Africa have also been attributed to the Pseudosuchians, but they are too fragmentary to say much about them. Like many other crocodilomorphs, these impressive carnivores, even the giant Neosuchia, had disappeared from most of the world by the end of the Eocene epoch. However, Pseudosuchians persisted much longer in South America. These terrestrial Pseudosuchians, including the dinosaur-sized Borenosuchus, survived on the isolated continent until a mere 12 million years ago. The extinction of the Pseudosuchians left their sister clade Neosuchia as the sole remaining crocodilomorphs. One of the most basal Neosuchians was Berksuchus. Its hind limbs were already held in a crocodilian-like stance, while its forelimbs were more upright. Unfortunately, the transition to the more crocodile-like Neosuchians is surprisingly under-researched. A number of semi-terrestrial Neosuchians with short snouts are lumped together in the clade Etoposauridae, but this is a wastebasket taxon whose members were not all close relatives. Some may have been the descendants of basal Neosuchians who had never fully transitioned into a crocodilian-like lifestyle. Others, like Theriosuchus, seem to be more derived species who returned to a primarily terrestrial existence. The true Etoposaurids consisted of 5 species who inhabited European islands during the late Jurassic. The rest could be found on the mainland up to the early Cretaceous, but some, like Aprosuchus, persisted on the islands of Europe right to the very end of the Mesozoic era. However, by the Middle Jurassic, most Neosuchians were already semi-aquatic ambush predators with elongated snouts, semi-erect limbs, and crocodilian-like metabolisms. The crocodile-like Chalcoiasuchus may push their origins back to the early Jurassic, although it may instead be a freshwater relative of the Thalattosuchians. One of the most diverse Mesozoic branches of Neosuchia was Goniophyllidinae, which lasted from the Middle Jurassic to the late Cretaceous. Examination of the skull of the late Jurassic Goniophyllid Amphicodilus found it already had the bones to support a gular sac, allowing it to safely open its mouth in the water, and therefore hunt as the crocodilians of today do. However, although the most critical traits evolved early on, it is important to remember that the early Neosuchians were evolutionary trailblazers, while the crocodilians of today have had over 150 million years to perfect their ecology. Since the Mesozoic Neosuchians were not competing directly with the dinosaurs, but instead replacing the now extinct phytosaurs, they were able to swiftly grow much larger than the typical land crocs of their day. That said, most of the Neosuchians of the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods were still only within the size range of their modern descendants. They were deadly predators, but lower in the food chain than the largest theropod dinosaurs. Some extinct Neosuchians, like the 60-centimeter-long Cumpiodontossuchus, were actually smaller than any modern species of crocodilian. Cumpiodontossuchus is thought to have been a specialized predator who used its stout back teeth to consume hard-shelled prey like snails. Of course, some Neosuchians dwarfed all extant reptiles. One of these, the supercroc Sarcosuchus, lived in North Africa during the early Cretaceous. With a minimum length of 9 meters, and perhaps even 12, it was one of the top predators of its environment, and could threaten even the largest contemporary theropods. However, this was not the only niche the supercroc filled. Although all young crocodilians hunt different prey as they grow larger, Sarcosuchus took this to an extreme. Juveniles had very narrow snouts reminiscent of those of gavialids, which allowed them to live as specialized piscivores. As they grew, their longirostrine snouts broadened significantly, allowing them to shift to their more famous roles as dinosaur killers. The closely related Chalawan was only a little smaller than Sarcosuchus. It lived in Thailand between 150 to 140 million years ago. It and Sarcosuchus belonged to a major Neosuchian subclade called Tethasuchia. The other Tethasuchians, like Elosuchus, generally had long snouts, but unlike Sarcosuchus, tended to be piscivores comparable to its juvenile form. Although Elosuchus lived in freshwater environments like the supercroc, Tethasuchians typically hunted in brackish or marine waters. Some of the most successful Tethasuchians outside of Crocodilia were the Dirosaurids, who served as the late Cretaceous replacements of the Teleosauroids. While primarily coastal predators, Dirosaurid juveniles seem to have grown up in freshwater environments. While most Dirosaurids had the longirostrine snouts of piscivores, the Basal and Thracosuchus had a broad brevirostrine skull and powerful teeth to deal with hard-shelled prey. Dirosaurids varied in size, with the largest reaching lengths of at least 8 meters. The limbs of the Dirosaurid Brachiosuchus were unusually long, but the rest of its postcranial anatomy was not particularly well suited for terrestrial locomotion, so their function is currently a mystery. Indeed, many other Dirosaurids were unable to gallop or perform the high walk as adults since their trunk musculature and osteoderm morphology was built differently from crocodilians. Dirosaurids first evolved during the late Cretaceous, but they persisted through the KPG mass extinction and thrived until the milder extinction during the Eocene. Until recently, it was assumed they were the only Pseudosuchians besides crocodilians and Sebecosuchians which survived into the Cenozoic era. Among the recently discovered Cenozoic crocodilomorphs is another branch of Tethasuchians called Phylletosaurids. While their post-KPG fossils are currently restricted to Paleocene Morocco, Phylletosaurids had been much more successful during the Mesozoic era and may have included Sarcosuchus and Elosuchus among their number. Despite the reputation crocodilians have for being unchanging, the evolutionary adaptability seen in the rest of Pseudosuchia didn't end when the Neosuchians became semi-aquatic. Some of the strangest Almost-Crocodiles were the Stomatosuchids, who had massive, broad, yet delicate skulls. It is hypothesized that they evolved to feed upon large schools of fish, and were perhaps even filter feeders. The largest of these whale crocs, Stomatosuchus, is estimated to have been 10 meters long. The Stomatosuchids inhabited the freshwater swamps of North Africa during the middle of the Cretaceous period. As mentioned previously, some Neosuchians became dedicated plant eaters. The small Eharcutosuchus and its less specialized relative Acynodon lived in Eastern Europe during the late Cretaceous, using their powerful brevirostrine snouts to crush plant matter instead of animals. In North America, the Neosuchian Scolomastax is thought to have been an omnivore, although not enough of it has been preserved to determine the rest of its ecology. Some Neosuchians, such as the small Tarsomordio, followed in the drier footsteps of their ancestors. This fully terrestrial Neosuchian lived in North America during the early Cretaceous, and seems to have filled a similar niche to the locally extinct Protosuchians. Tarsomordio was in a position to fill this vacancy since Neosuchians were the only crocodilomorphs present in North America after the Jurassic period. The European Allodaposuchus hulkai spent more time on land than most other Neosuchians, but it hadn't fully abandoned the water either. It technically appeared in the 2003 documentary Dinosaur Planet, but only in name, as its model was actually just a recolored Notosuchus. This was particularly erroneous since Allodaposuchus hulkai was even more closely related to Crocodilia than most other Neosuchians were, with both belonging within the advanced clade Eusuchia. Some papers have even found that its branch of Eusuchia, Allodaposuchidae, could be a subclade of true crocodilians. The rest of Allodaposuchidae, including the other species of Allodaposuchus, lacked the terrestrial adaptations of Allodaposuchus hulki. These advanced Neosuchians were common in Europe during the late Cretaceous, and presumably hunted in a typical crocodile-like fashion. Much of Europe was covered by the Tethys Sea at the time, constraining the size of the island-dwelling dinosaurs, so although none of them were megacrocs, Allodaposuchids were high in the food chain. In a land of dwarf dinosaurs, the titanic proportions of Sarcosuchus were simply unnecessary. Even though Neosuchians were most common in the northern Laurasian continents, by the late Jurassic, they were present on every landmass except for what is now Australia and Antarctica. Their absence there was likely since both continents were close to the South Pole, and therefore their climates were too cold to support large ectothermic predators. Although Mesozoic crocodilomorph fossils have yet to be found in the frozen continent, Neosuchians colonized Australia after it became warmer during the middle of the Cretaceous period. Beforehand, their niche had been filled by large brachiopoid temnospondyls such as Coolosuchus. Giant amphibians such as these had been hunting in rivers and streams long before the emergence of the Proto-Crocodilians, and their ancestors had been contemporaries of the amphibious phytosaurs and numerous terrestrial Pseudosuchians during the Triassic period. Crocodilia, the Pseudosuchian crown group, evolved during the late Cretaceous. Fossils belonging to all three main branches, Crocodiloidea, Gavialoidea, and Alligatoroidea, have been found dating from that time. However, most unambiguous Mesozoic crocodilian fossils belong to North American alligatoroids. The largest Mesozoic crown crocodilian was the alligatoroid Dinosuchus, who could grow at least 10 meters long and weighed roughly the same as Tyrannosaurus rex. Combined with its devastating jaws, a fully grown Dinosuchus was capable of killing even the largest contemporary dinosaurs. It ironically died out just before the Tyrant King came onto the scene, but Dinosuchus had been regularly confronting its smaller predecessors for the previous 10 million years. Still, the majority of the Mesozoic crocodilians, such as Stangerochampsa and Brachychampsa, were about the same size as modern species. It was during the Cenozoic when crocodilians became the dominant Neosuchians. The high global temperatures during the early Cenozoic were perfect for large ectotherms. Even Antarctica was subtropical, and an isolated crocodilian tooth dated to the Eocene indicates that Pseudosuchians had finally come to inhabit every single continent. Besides the marine Dirosaurids, it is unclear how many other Neosuchian lineages survived into the Cenozoic era, since it is often difficult to tell true crocodilians apart from closely related Eusuchians. One example are the species within the genus Borealosuchus, who are either the closest relatives of Crocodilia or the most basal true crocodilians. They started out as medium-sized generalists, but some Cenozoic species of Borealosuchus grew 5 meters long. Another example is the Longirostrine Thoracosaurs, marine piscivores who may or may not have been early gavialids. Some fragmentary Cretaceous Thoracosaur fossils suggest a length of 8 or more meters, but the more typical 4 to 5 meter long specimens are currently the largest known survivors of the KPG mass extinction. Most crocodilians were semi-aquatic ambush predators like those of today, but a clade called the planocraniids were quick to take advantage of the ecological vacancies left by the dinosaurs, becoming some of the top terrestrial predators in North America and Eurasia during the first half of the Age of Mammals. They had the standard land croc traits such as long, straight legs, deep skulls, and zyphodont teeth. The planocraniid Bovarisuchus is nicknamed the hooved crocodile for its large, blunt claws which helped it to run even faster. It was also potentially the last Pseudosuchian capable of bipedal locomotion, but it is more likely that Bovarisuchus was a more traditional quadruped. While usually considered crown crocodilians, the already derived nature of the earliest planocraniids makes it difficult to distinguish them from the more basal Eusuchians. Although the larger dinosaurs were gone, few crocodilians besides the planocraniids took the opportunity to replace them, instead simply filling the empty niches of other Neosuchians, allowing mammals to eventually become the new dominant animals. Like many of the other remaining Pseudosuchians, the planocraniids died out as a result of the cooling climate during the Eocene. The more traditional crocodilians didn't come out of it unscathed either. Among the casualties was Orientalosuchina, a major branch of crocodilians endemic to Asia. Further cooling during the Miocene resulted in the extinction of the European alligatoroids, including the highly successful genus Diplocynodon, restricting Alligatoroidea to the Americas until the ancestors of the Chinese alligator migrated to East Asia. Even though crocodilians now had essentially no competition, cooler temperatures drove them to the equator, and today only the two species of alligator can survive outside of the tropics. In spite of all of this, Crocodilia's highest point was ahead of them. During the Middle Miocene, much of South America consisted of mind-bogglingly vast wetlands, providing the perfect habitat for crocodilians. More species of amphibious crocodilomorphs were able to coexist here than at any other point in their history, giving them the opportunity to specialize, producing some of the weirdest crocodilians of the Cenozoic era. Among these was the giant caiman Pterosaurus, who was reminiscent of the dinosaur-eating Dinosuchus, and was likewise one of the most dangerous predators to ever evolve. The largest species of this megacroc, Pterosaurus brasiliensis, grew between 7.5 to 9 meters long, making Miocene South America a particularly perilous place. Less frightening but more bizarre crocodilians were the four species of the caiman Murasuchus. They had massive yet delicate jaws like those of the Mesozoic stomatosuchids, and may have also been filter feeders. However, their ecology is still poorly understood, and it has been proposed that species of Murasuchus may have instead employed a less specialized strategy called gulp feeding to catch large groups of small fish, or may have dug through the mud in search of bivalves. Unlike today, the crocodilian paradise in Miocene South America was home to slender-snouted gavialids. In general, extinct gavialids hunted in a manner similar to either Tomistoma or the more specialized gharial, but the gavialid Gryposuchus croizati was comparable in size to Pterosaurus. Although not as fearsome as it or other previously mentioned megacrocs like Sarcosuchus, Gryposuchus was still able to hunt large animals by virtue of its sheer size. The later Indian gavialid Ramphosuchus grew 10 meters long, as did the African Euthecodon, a crocodile closely related to today's slender-snouted crocodiles. Back in Miocene South America, the expansive wetlands were home to numerous species of clams, and multiple varieties of caimans evolved short skulls and blunt, crushing teeth to take advantage of this abundant food source. The most specialized of these mollusk-eating crocs was the shovel-headed Notosuchus. In addition to semi-aquatic species, the crocodilian paradise was also inhabited by the last of the cebechids, including the deadly Borenosuchus. Crocodilian diversity in South America peaked around 12 million years ago, but like the Pseudosuchian Golden Age and the Notosuchian Renaissance, the crocodilian paradise eventually came to an end, albeit not as suddenly. Uplift from the Andes Mountains divided the once vast wetlands into a few distinct, if massive, rivers like the Amazon. Combined with declining temperatures, the specialized species of crocodilians were slowly rendered extinct over the next 7 million years. The survivors, such as the extant Yakari caiman, were generalists. That doesn't mean crocodilians stopped evolving in weird directions, as will be made abundantly clear by the last group which will be covered, Mecosuchinae. Mecosuchians were native to Cenozoic Australia and the surrounding islands, which, fortunately for them, were much warmer than during the Jurassic period. Where they fit within Crocodilia is still unclear, but in practice, they're a fourth, extinct branch of the clade. While the previously mentioned Asian clade, Orientalosuchina, is usually considered a subclade of alligatoroids, a recent review of Mecosuchian diversity found that they may instead be nested deep within Mecosuchinae. Australia was isolated for much of the Cenozoic era, and Mecosuchians diversified to fill the typical crocodilian niches there. They included generalists such as Cambara, the shallow water specialist Baru, a number of dwarf taxa, and a potentially longirostrine taxon named Ultrastenos. The most famous Mecosuchians are the fully terrestrial species. Most of these land crocs were rather small, between 1 to 3 meters long. As mentioned earlier, Mecosuchus itself is considered by some paleontologists to have been a specialized tree dweller. However, others consider an ecology like that of the African dwarf crocodiles, who already primarily hunt on land, more likely. Some species of the Neosuchian quincana had a length of at least 3 meters, and some fragmentary fossils suggest some individuals grew up to 6 meters. Combined with its zyphodont teeth, quincana was one of the top predators of Ice Age Australia. As the continent became more arid during the Miocene, Neosuchia's diversity suffered greatly. Increased competition from gavialoids and species of Crocodilus worsened matters. It is unclear if Neosuchians were still left on the mainland when humanity arrived on Australia 50,000 years ago, but they may have proven to be the final nail in Neosuchia's coffin. As dangerous as quincana was, it was no match for spears, fire, and the destruction of the dwindling megafauna it fed upon. Even after the last ice age, 2 species of Neosuchus continued to survive on the isolated island chains of Vanuatu and New Caledonia. They were safe on their island sanctuaries until humans colonized them as well 3,000 years ago, and drove the last of the Neosuchians to extinction. Despite being typecast as semi-aquatic animals, the last 3,000 years have been the only time the world lacked a terrestrial Pseudosuchian ever since the start of the Triassic Period 250 million years ago. The Pseudosuchians of prehistory were truly extraordinary, whether they were terrestrial or aquatic. As this video has hopefully made clear, the lack of attention given to prehistoric stem crocodilians in most paleontology media is undeserved. Their absence makes the Mesozoic world, and to a lesser extent the Cenozoic world, appear far less dynamic and diverse than they truly were. The Jurassic and Cretaceous periods were filled with various little land crocs that most people don't even know existed. The famous long-necked plesiosaurs and fish-like ichthyosaurs once shared the Jurassic seas with fully marine crocodilomorphs. Some plant-eating Pseudosuchians had the most sophisticated teeth in all of reptilia. The largest terrestrial predators of the Cenozoic era were not mammals like the saber-toothed Smilodon, but instead the gigantic Cebechids. And the dinosaurs emerged in an alien world teeming with stem crocodiles. Far from being unchanging, Pseudosuchians were no less adaptable than their dinosaur cousins. Even the crocodilian-like Neosuchians were often very different from modern crocodilians, including gigantic, dinosaur-killing megacrocs like Dinosuchus, and specialists unlike anything else alive today. Unlike the prevailing thinking in decades past, the stem crocodilians were not primitive stepping stones who were outcompeted by the more advanced dinosaurs or mammals. As Archosaurs, Pseudosuchians already had most of the traits which made the dinosaurs so successful, and were in many ways the dinosaurs before the dinosaurs. Both had elevated metabolisms and fully erect gaits, which was a major factor behind Pseudosuchia's success during the Triassic period. It is little wonder that some species like the Shuvosaurids came to resemble the dinosaurs in other ways. The Pseudosuchian Golden Age ended only due to a mass extinction which also devastated the rest of the world's fauna. Most of the later crocodilomorph lineages which weren't outcompeted by their fellow Pseudosuchians were rendered extinct by the same meteor that ended the age of dinosaurs or in the wake of other major climate catastrophes. The capacity of crocodilians and their ancestors to endure and bounce back from such extinction events is frankly remarkable. While the surviving crocodilians do resemble many of the Mesozoic Neosuchians, they are not very good representatives of the rest of Pseudosuchia, as they have changed greatly due to their amphibious ecology and their reversion to a lower ectothermic metabolism. Of course, this itself is a demonstration of the clade's adaptability. Their endurance through time came not from being unchanging, but through shifting their metabolic and ecological strategies throughout their evolutionary history, with crocodilians being merely the most recent example. However, that does not mean they are invincible, as the Neosuchians were not the last Pseudosuchians to be imperiled by humanity. Humans wiped out the Chinese gavialid Hanyusuchus and the Malagasy horned crocodile Voe just a few hundred years ago. And as of right now, 8 species of crocodilians are critically endangered due to human activity such as poaching and habitat destruction. Only if humanity treats the world responsibly will Pseudosuchia's 250 million year story have a chance to continue.
Thank you for watching, and a thank you to the Mandalorian for narrating this video. Also, a thank you to Armin Reindl for helping to review the script and ensuring it was as accurate as possible. I hope this video has achieved its aim of giving an accurate and easily understood overview of the Pseudosuchians, and sparked interest in learning even more about these fascinating reptiles. If you enjoyed it, please remember to hit the like button, and subscribe if you would like to see more videos like this, particularly those about stem crocodilians. Finally, be sure to have a great day.